Okay. So, and when we were going back and forth on email, not last week, but the week before, we talked about maybe thinking through some of the possibilities of what a relatively near future of economic abundance might look like. I was curious if we could sort of contemplate that through the lens of maybe a specific case. I'm thinking kind of specifically about South Australia and what an energy abundance from renewable power from solar and wind might look like, and but with an eye looking further ahead to what happens to economies when things become really cheap, thanks to an abundance um, of inputs, sort of fundamental factors of production like energy and transportation and machine labor. It just sort of in combination, each individually, but certainly in combination, just sort of serve to drive the basic cost of things way down, but that are also low impact. So that economic reduction in cost doesn't come at the expense of the environment or society in the way that it might have in eras of cheap oil energy abundance in certain parts of the world in the past. So um, I didn't really want to have sort of a very super narrow and constrained conversation. I was just hoping to kind of pick everybody's brains about not so much what do we. I mean, yes, it would be fun to contemplate what might the future look like, and do some of that sort of visioning work. That's great. But what I'm actually more interested in is how to think about this stuff. And this is sort of following my organization's basic recipe, which is what assumptions do we make, explicit and implicit, that are just not going, that are going to be obviated, they're going to be invalidated by the changes that are coming. And as a result of those, how would we need to think differently? Not necessarily, okay, well, let's imagine exactly what the future of X, Y, or Z is going to look like when these changes come. But more important than that, I think, because that's very difficult to predict or foresee. How do we think differently about all of this? So anyway, I think that would be useful, very useful for me. I think it probably would. It has the potential to be a fun kind of free-ranging conversation, but I think that would be very helpful to me because I'm now in my organization under pressure to put the disruptions together. So to say, okay, well, you've talked about energy and maybe what's going to happen there. You've talked about transportation, maybe what's going to happen there, food, what's going to happen there. And the questions that we get now are of the kind of, okay, so you put all these things together and what? Why should I, how should I think differently? How should I make decisions differently? How should I plan differently in my industry, in my society, in my decision-making roles, and whatever they might be, knowing these things? And we are hoping to come up with ways to start answering those sorts of questions, or at least begin conversations about them. So anyway, that's where I'm coming from. If that sounds like something that might be fun, let's do it.
Good. I'm writing on the board here. What should I add to this list? Energy, transportation, food, intelligence. Is there anything else I missed?
Well, the big four in my mind, and intelligence captures the fourth one, is human labor. So basically what we're entering, I think, is an era maybe over the next 15 to 20 years where the technologies that are either commercialized today or are and ready for deployment and scaling, or are going to be commercialized in the foreseeable future, those are going to disrupt, in our terms, technology disruption, are going to disrupt those four sectors of the economy. So energy, transportation, food and agriculture, and then human labor. And I mean, they're all quite extraordinary, but I do suspect that in the final analysis, the human labor one's probably the biggest, and that's automation. I've said, Dan, going back a decade many times, I personally suspect that the automation of driving is the tip of the automation iceberg. That will be the advancement that triggers an automation avalanche, and that it's sort of the first and initial case and proof of concept, and that if and when a autonomous driving solution emerges that really works, and whatever approach, I'm thinking, software as very broadly conceived and defined, but whatever software approach slash machine intelligence approach works with self-driving vehicles is going to open the door to proper automation of much of the rest of human labor, and the floodgates are going to open, and it won't be 100 years. It'll be something more like 15 years from that point until we start seeing very substantial changes in the global human labor market, where machines are just are built and um, are used to displace human work. And yeah, so I kind of suspect that that's the big one. And there's been a lot of talk in science fiction and in various futurist communities and so on for many years about the significance of that. So we tend not to focus on it. It's hard to it's far enough away still that details are difficult to put um, into modeling, strict modeling terms or anything like that. But it is a big one. It's definitely coming. We have to keep it in mind. Okay. But yeah, the four of them. The other thing is that the four of them in combination. I mean, holy crap, right? I mean, even just one of these in a generation would be, that would be more than enough to be very impressed by. But if all four of these things are going to change sort of fundamentally within a 20 or 25-year period, so by 2040, probably 2045, and I think we can imagine some pretty staggering, frankly, consequences across society and the global economy. So the questions are: is there anything meaningful that we can do now, right now, think more clearly about this, so that we can plan more clearly, so that we can avoid mistakes, so that we can basically maximize the benefits of this tremendous transformation that's likely to occur, minimize the harms along the way? That's basically our mission, is to help facilitate a journey for all of us that is maximally beneficial, minimally harmful. That's the general idea. And presumably there are good decisions to be made, there are mistakes to be made, there are better ways to do things and worse ways to do things if we can discover what they are. And the only way to do that is to start thinking about them and start talking about them in a discipline, in a rigorous way. So that's the general picture here, I think.
It seems to me that in many of your reports, you're already considering at least two of these disruptions in tandem, right? I mean, often you're discussing, say, the precision fermentation changes in the context of much cheaper energy and so on. So you sort of mean, maybe when you talk about considering more than one at once, you maybe mean something like three at once or something. I'm not sure.
Yes, that's correct. That we have a few instances where we have put two obvious pieces together. So, for example, electric vehicles and solar, wind, and batteries, and clean energy and electric vehicles. That's a natural fit. Certainly, the batteries that are used in the energy disruption and the batteries that are used in the transportation disruption, a direct connection, very clearly something that we would need to think about. And so we've mentioned that before, but many things are not obvious at all when you are talking about the convergence of the three of these. Really quite surprising things emerge, which is what my colleague Brad, talked us through several weeks ago. A few examples of those. I mean, one of the ones that I continue to have my mind blown a bit about are the implications for global shipping and for global steel, iron ore and steel. In my mind, those are not obvious really at all, and yet, and those are very, very large industries, and they are really going to be impacted by these things. And you just, if you didn't really have this lens through which to see, you would not see any of that coming. And I suspect that there's an entire, I don't know, have a metaphor, like a whole uh, panoply galaxy of phenomena that are going to be like that over the next 20 years or so. Where in retrospect, sure, it'll maybe feel a bit obvious, but it's very difficult to see that coming ahead of time unless you really put work into trying to think through it. So yeah, I think all three or all four of these things in combination, that's where the non-obvious stuff is, and it would be great to gain some insight there. And the one piece of work that we did where we tried to do that so far has been in climate change, where we put the at least the first order impacts that we could attempt to quantify in general, in broad terms in three different scenarios. We put that together for energy, transportation, and food, and said, okay, here's what the big picture is: climate change and for greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. But that's just one example, one domain of implications among however many dozens, right?
Yeah, what's the best way to systematically approach this? I mean, I suppose there's various scenarios and things I've been doing over the last few years to get myself to think through these things from a more first principles approach, but that's more like just noticing certain things while being out in the world. I can give some examples, I guess, but I mean, the South Australia, when I'm struck just traveling around in Australia, which is a large and largely arid continent, how much the way we think about, I mean, our sense of national identity, or just even the words we use, like outback, right, which sort of has no clear meaning, but means something like further towards the center of the country than I usually go. These terms refer to basically patterns of rainfall and how much water is available. Whereas if you think through the kind of things you've talked about with the exponential decrease in the cost of energy thanks to solar and the possibility for very large-scale desalination, the landscape literally of possibilities of how we choose to use land basically opens up in a way that's never been possible before. I mean, we could choose to make huge parts of Australia rainforest if we wanted, really.
Yeah, I mean, one way that I've been thinking about this recently is to invert the assumption about scarcity. I mean, one of the fundamental definitions of economics or an economy is the allocation of scarce resources. And what that assumption presumes is that the system is supply limited, and relative to supply, demand is either extremely large or limited. I mean, you often see more sloppy use of the term infinite, but what people really mean is that it's functionally unlimited. That the demand always outstrips supply by some very large margin, and so all of our allocation resources and so forth is all sort of structured around scarcity, around constraints on demand. And so one thing I've been trying to think through is what would an economy look like was instead demand limited. It was structured around limitations on demand, where because I see this in environment. Just permit me a quick aside. Environmental discourse, I often hear this tendency to invoke outdated stereotype or whatever of I believe it's called Homo economicus. It's this mythological, perfectly rational, wealth maximizing, utility maximizing consumer or something like that. And one of the embedded assumptions within that that very simple caricatured agent is that wants unlimited. This rational agent wants an unlimited amount of utility in all domains. And when you stop and think through this, it actually doesn't hold up. And a really great example of that is in food. Right? I mean, even billionaires don't. There's a limit to how many calories they consume. This is and it's pretty low limit, right? I guess you could, even if you're being completely wasteful and throwing crazy parties and buying 5 or 10 times more food than anybody could possibly eat. 10 times more food than we produce today is a lot more than we produce today, but it's not unlimited, and it's certainly nowhere near infinitely more. And it's not even 100 or 1,000 times more. It's just 10 times more. And so the more I've thought about it, the more I see through throughout the economy examples like that, where demand is, in principle, people might like a lot more than they have today, a lot more. And I think of a very rich person's lifestyle, but it's nowhere near unlimited. And other limits, come into play. Things like social pressures to not be, a douchebag or whatever, start to constrain people's behaviors fairly quickly, I think, or might well, presuming no major cultural shifts, although presumably those would happen too. But at any rate, this is a lens that I've been now trying to think through this which is what you would still have an economy. There would still be production. There would still be consumption. There would still need to be coordination of those two things: what's produced and what's consumed. What if there is demand, and how would you supply it, and so forth. But this fundamental constraint would be on demand. It wouldn't be necessarily on supply, which would be a complete transformation, a very, very profound change. So if that's the general picture, what does that look like in any given domain? And then you made some really great big picture examples there, Dan. Like if energy wasn't constrained, we could do some pretty astonishing things. One of which is solve a lot of concerns around water scarcity. But I think there are a lot of examples like that. So anyway, that's just one sort of 35,000 foot way to view on this. I don't know. I think maybe all of this is still too vague and abstract in general, and maybe we need to get to specifics to do something productive here. But anyway, that's where I'm.
Yeah, on a
specific coming from.
On a specific, let me ask you how you think about soil. So when you say allocation of scarce resources, that often suggests like commodities, right? Like oil or something. Now, oil is finite, but it's simple. I mean, maybe its process of production is not straightforward, but it's something you could imagine producing in large quantities from a relatively simple process if you chose to. But soil is not like that, right? I mean, to grow food in soil, you can't just make soil cheaply, as far as I know. You need to, it's basically a living thing, or a semi-living thing. You know more about it than I do, but certainly you need all sorts of fungal growth in it, and mycelial networks, and many other very complicated things. So it seems like soil you need to basically grow, or some sort of process like growing. So maybe there aren't, the kind of resources that will be made hyper abundant by these disruptions maybe don't include resources that have an aspect of time complexity from a computer science point of view. That is, there's a certain amount of time, or maybe a certain amount of steps that it takes to produce soil, which involves living things growing and dying, and some of the complexity inherent in the resources. You can't really cheat that time, that process. So maybe, moving away from using soil to produce food, as you seem to be kind of, that's what the precision fermentation, at least, maybe there's feedstock that goes into it, but maybe it's fairly simple feedstock. But there are other resources involved which maybe you can't cheat in a way, right? Biodiversity is one, I guess, where it's very easy to destroy and very hard to create. So if those other resources become hyper abundant, it tends to suggest that attention and everything. I mean, we will come to value much more highly those things which have an aspect of time complexity, right? Um, I'm just thinking around the question of how to think through the impact of the disruptions. I mean, maybe it makes sense to focus on the invariant things. That's what a mathematician will do, right? If there's changes you want to understand, then you focus on those quantities which are invariant. And if so, that means that maybe if the disruption is changing many, many things, you focus on exactly those things that you expect to be completely invariant to the disruption. So what things are left, what things do you have for some reason to believe are left unchanged by any of these disruptions? I mean, no matter how much AI there is, it doesn't make the fungus grow any faster. So that's my first thought on that.
Think that has like an economic consequence because you can talk about um, supply and demand, but and like unleashing supply. But if there are still some things that are supply limited, then there will still be a need for um, that will still drive prices, and like people will still want money, for example, for the things that they still need to like have money to buy. Um,
Yeah, you can famously see that in the graphs of costs of living over the last 20 years. You can see health and education. I forget the other major one, maybe it's housing. They go up like crazy and everything else is collapsing down to nothing. Uh, I think at least health and education clearly have this kind of characteristic like I'm describing of soil, right? Housing, I guess, is just different.
there's actually this is a little bit back to something we were talking about earlier. I think there's a class of things that people study in economics where you do have a functionally unlimited demand, which means that you can't really stop them from being scarce without some other, like, I mean, maybe there's another solution, but and so I'm talking about positional goods, which you've probably heard about. These are goods where it's like um, it's like an arms race between you and other members of society, how much of this good you own, and what matters is like the relative rank of um, your goods compared to the rest of the world. And because it's kind of like a race, it kind of keeps driving demand up and up, no matter how high you go, because it's all relative. Um, and there are lots of examples of this. I think you would find lots of them if you look, but I'm not an economist, so this is not my thing. But that so actually a question that I've had since I think one of the first Meta Uni events, Adam, you talked about the superpower idea, and I was just thinking, would this actually, let's say you unlock the supply of electricity through renewables, and I was just wondering if demand would really have a limit, like it would really see a limit, because it seems to me like if you have more energy, we're just going to use more energy. And for example, I can think of things like cryptocurrency mining, or just blockchain technologies in general, where these use in some models lots of energy and generate wealth for people. And wealth is like you might consider it a positional good, or you might consider it a key to other positional goods. Um, there's still a lot of demand for wealth, so why wouldn't there be just like an unlimited demand for Bitcoin suddenly, and or not unlimited, but like it would increase along with the increasing supply. And so I'm not sure we would ever get to this concept of abundance where supply far outweighs demand.
That example is a bit flawed because there's a cap on the number of bitcoins, and once we hit that, then there's only transaction costs, so it would come down to the amount of economic activity that's taking place. But yeah, I guess I take the point.
I take the point, and I probably should have been I was probably a bit sloppy when I originally laid out sort of this general framing, but I, 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 I think it's really what it points to is that we need to make a distinction between things that are sort of properly, in some formal sense, unbounded or unlimited, and positional goods is a great example of that. That's a very, very good example. There are others that are sort of conceivably demand could become very, very large under certain circumstances, but one could imagine supply, perhaps again, with, after time, if you've got it could have time complexity. So things could be time constrained, but one might imagine, at least in principle, supply could expand enormously relative to today, and cost could remain very low. And energy may fall into a category like that, where I mean, I think we quite fully expect energy consumption to increase by at least an order of magnitude. I just, as a longtime science fiction fan and so forth, I mean, I'm thinking more on the Kardashev scale, right? I mean, first it's the entire planet, and then it's the entire star's energy output, and then it's the whole galaxy. I mean, that is maybe in the longer term, and this is maybe not thousands of years even away, but perhaps a century or two, we start getting to very, 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 very large levels of energy consumption relative to today. So superpower is just a very small beginning to that, really. But nevertheless, compared to today, we are talking about massive increases, right? Compared to today and compared to prior human experience. So that's another that's demand is limited there, but it's so much more than today that you have this transformative character through the shift between here and there to consider. And then finally, there are things that are where demand is properly limited and really isn't likely to grow very much more than where we are today. And that may be examples like the number of calories that human beings consume, right?
What about the number of human beings?
Ooh, good one. Very, very good one.
Because in relation to the calories, because it may not be about, it's not really about how many calories an individual consumes, because there's not a fixed number of individuals.
That's true. Yeah. It's a very good question. I mean, right now we're on trajectory to have population growth halt, and the population level off somewhere between 9 and 10 billion. Those are the latest projections that I've seen. Maybe you guys have seen different. But
does that take
there are a lot of assumptions baked in there, right? There are a lot of assumptions.
Yeah, that's interesting because let's say we transform the livable landscape through an abundance of renewable energy or something like that, and now suddenly all of Australia that is currently underpopulated or really not very populated can become as dense as Melbourne or other places in the world. I mean, just hypothetically, you could multiply the current population of the world probably several times if you start considering what you could do with all of the land.
Right.
Not just land that's currently hospitable.
Right. Another way to think about maybe I'm not sure. Anyway, somebody I've read fairly recently used the framing of carrying capacity. It was probably because I've read his work recently. It was probably David Deutsch I'm thinking of because I've read a couple of his books recently. But I think his framing, and it wasn't him. It was somebody else, not me. But framing what we're framing the large scale impact, the totality of all these changes in terms of the planet's carrying capacity, and the idea being that together. These technological advances that we're talking about would radically increase the carrying capacity of the planet in terms of the resource provision, and I suppose if you want to think about it through the lens of population as well, you could think about it in terms of the human population carrying capacity. Another way to think about it would be sort of the carrying capacity in terms of lifestyle. So if the carrying capacity increases, then for any given population, that the per capita income and by proxy, that being a proxy for the quality of life, that could increase as the carrying capacity of the planet increases with these sort of technological tools. So that's perhaps a way to think about it too.
Can you be more precise about what the purpose of envisioning? I mean, obviously, if there are big changes coming, you want to understand their joint effects, but I sense behind this question that your maybe real intent is a little bit different. Maybe I can say what I think it is, and then you can tell me whether you agree or not. If you're concerned about what widespread depression about the end of the world and people choosing actively to not pursue improvements in technology and other things that would avert that, that maybe having in mind actually possible projects, like, I mean, I'm not saying turning the desert into rainforest is actually a thing we want to do. Deserts are not bad places for some things. But if you have a vision of doing something crazy but awesome like that, maybe that's a way of actually motivating people to do the more mundane things on the way, which, if you do them, avert disaster. But if you just tell people to avert disaster, nobody's sufficiently motivated to do those things. They just crawl up into balls and die. I mean, maybe one way of saying that in short is SpaceX seems to get a lot done because they want to go to Mars. You could have aimed to do those things just to make a lot of money, or to avert some, disaster, but somehow people seem more motivated to go to Mars in some sense than to avert those things.
So as usual, Dan, you've I must be very transparent to you. At any rate, this is very, very close to the mark. So my motivations here are two things. The first is that I think it's now become a deep concern of mine that shapes all of my thinking, and these conversations go back a ways with you and I, Dan. That I'm deeply concerned about pessimism, and because I think it's very consequential. I think that the pessimism has already and has the potential to translate into some very serious problems and some real harms. And we would really be shooting ourselves in the foot, especially at this sort of quite extraordinary turning point in human history, if we allow that to prevail and to undermine our the enterprise of human progress itself. I think this is as you and I've discussed, Dan, I think this is an underappreciated problem that humanity now has, that people's faith in or confidence in human progress has been eroded by a variety of forces. Not, one of which is the idea that we can't solve climate change and we're all doomed, but others as well, and a general pervasive pessimism and so forth. And so part of my motivation is to provide tools with which to justify optimism and think more constructively about progress and what can be achieved. So that's the first thing is that I think that's important. Second piece of it is that what I'm trying to do, and what I Rethink X, my organization, I think in a way also, although I don't speak exactly for everybody, and I'm not, we're all not of a single mind, different views. My bosses, Tony and Jamie, have slightly different perspectives on these things. But anyway, my view is that we want to be doing something quite different than the more typical science fiction singularity, transhumanist kind of crowd, because what we want to do is the hard work of charting the path between here and a more positive future at some interval, at some point. And it's obviously the target's never static; it's always moving, but at some point in the future. So instead of saying, "Well, listen, here are 100 ways in which things are going to be amazing in the future at some point," which anybody can do, and science fiction's been doing for a very long time. The much harder thing to do, I think, to say, okay, well, the future is we have good reason to believe the future is bright, but what do we need to do here and now? What specific things do we need to do, not do, in order to get from here to there? And because there's a lot at stake, and a lot of a lot of bad things can happen along the way. So it's those two things. It's that I think that progress and optimism are very important, and I think it's important to be disciplined and rigorous in providing meaningful insight into planning and decision making in the here and now, as opposed to just listen, 100 years from now everybody will be fine. We'll all be uploaded, and we'll have a Dyson sphere under construction, whatever the nutty stuff is, right? I mean, maybe all that's great. Maybe that's all fine, but we're not going to get from here to there as smoothly as we otherwise could if we don't think carefully about these things right now. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm coming from. I think a lot of that you're very correctly, very keenly spotted ahead. So yeah. Okay. Well, sorry. Maybe we can dial something back down to something very specific, which is, again, what would super cheap, very, very abundant clean energy look like for South Australia? Because that's coming, right? I mean, that is not far away. So what will change in Australia as that becomes a reality? That's my question to you guys.
Wait, are you talking about if all the ice melted? Because I was actually just talking about that with my friend. Sorry, I haven't been paying attention. Yeah, every coastal city like Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, and Perth, they'd all be under if all the ice melted, because it'd be 70 meters, and Adelaide would be the last place. So at 50 meters. So yeah, Australia would just be no more. The plan would be to just flood Australia, because I mean, last time that happened, it lowered the sea level by 7 millimeters. So if we do that again, just flood most of Central Australia, it'd bring irrigation. It would lower the sea levels. There's a lot of reasons to flood Australia. I have nothing against Australia. I think it would help them a lot more than it would hurt them. Like, sure, you'll lose a few snakes and some kangaroos, but it would also, since most of Australia is just crappy desert, basically just Arizona, but even worse somehow. It would bring rainflow back, because I'm pretty sure Australia, back before the Aboriginals got there, it was a rainforest in the central part. They burned it all down because that's how they hunted.
So I mean, there are some quite serious proposals for greening North Africa, for example, and we know that there's a cyclical greening and then desertification that occurs across the Saharan belt, and so I mean, there are some quite serious proposals for those sorts of things, and I know there actually has been some effort at modeling, probably in Australia you're talking about as well, modeling what the global climate impacts of those sorts of mega projects might be.
And I don't think it would actually be that expensive if you do enough. It would only cost like a couple billion too, which is nothing. If hell, I think some people would be able to afford that. It's probably like 14, 15 billion at most to flood them. And I see absolutely no reason not to.
I can think of a few reasons, but at any rate, what this does is it opens up consideration of projects and undertakings at perhaps a scale that we haven't taken as seriously before, and the reason why is because they become technically and economically feasible in a way that they haven't been in the past. It's actually kind of an irony, because in the past, things were more socially feasible, perhaps, right? There was, there wasn't as much hesitancy to really reshape landscapes and make major changes, but we lacked the technical capacity and economic capacity to do it. And now that situation's inverted, where we may well have the power to do so, but we're not perhaps as reckless as societies were hundreds of years ago in terms of reshaping the world, for a variety of different reasons, right? Social, ecological concerns, and so on. But presumably we will have that power. It's a good question. Will we exercise, and how will we, and under what circumstances?
Okay, but
I was actually thinking more specifically about.
Let's come back to the
super
specific.
cheap energy.
Yeah. So there's this book, I guess, also called Superpower by Ross Garneau that Heath Winning was talking about in the event last year, which details at least several things that will happen once renewable energy becomes cheap in the very short term. One of them is sort of freshwater intensive and energy intensive forms of farming, which are already starting to come up in South Australia. So there's a tomato farm that's out in the middle of nowhere, has no access to fresh water, just as a desalination plant combined with a large solar installation and greenhouses. I think they grow. I don't know if it's as high as 10%, but it's maybe not a tiny percentage of the tomatoes that are consumed in South Australia already, and that will increase rapidly. So that's one thing. I guess the other thing it talks about in that book is various kinds of energy-intensive physical processes like aluminium manufacturing or aluminum for you, Adam, that could be. We dig up a lot of that stuff in Australia, but then we ship it to China, Japan, the US for the energy-intensive and somewhat messy parts that could be done in Australia.
Is there also a labour cost component there?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I guess that part itself is maybe not super labour-intensive, but the manufacturing downstream from that would be. I mean, steel producing is very labor-intensive. I don't know about aluminum.
Isn't aluminum easier to recycle than plastic? I know it's not a net loss. Sorry. Oh crap! I'm unmuted. Whoops.
The chief constraints, as I understand it, especially with metals, steel, aluminum, copper, others. The fundamental constraint really is energy, and the energy inputs take a number of different forms. Sometimes the chemical processes are used that could be replaced with a more energy intensive process, but we use a chemical alternative because doing the same process via energy would be more expensive. So, for example, for iron ore and steel, you can.
Oh, Jesus.
I believe you can. Understanding is that you can do all of the processing with electricity without coking coal and redox chemistry and a number of other processes like that. But it would be much more energy intensive. And so I think there are. Now, I'm not a chemist, but believe there are a number of heavy industry examples like that where if energy were super abundant, then it wouldn't be. It would if energy were super abundant, we would be able to undertake those processes differently than we do today, and clean them up a fair bit, and recycling certainly is a big piece of that, right? Because obviously metals can be recycled infinitely; they're just a stock. There's no flow there. So again, energy is sort of a key enabler in however you want to think about the functions of production there. But energy seems to be really enable a lot of what's going on there.
How did
and Superpower? Yeah, sorry, Superpower. The one of the things that we're seeing people beginning to talk about is how to structure a business so that it can take advantage of very inexpensive energy that isn't available all the time. So if it's, for example, only available for parts of the year, sort of seasonal availability, like in the summer when there's a superabundance of sunshine and so forth, could you structure your business around intermittent energy or not perfectly uniformly available 24/7 energy? Could you shape it around when it is extremely abundant and therefore very cheap? So that's the sort of thing that we're starting to hear people talk about, see if they can figure out ways to do that. And heavy industries like mining and metal production are where my team is already hearing those conversations.
Yeah, I do. There's a very dramatic tipping point when you have, or when you start to do those kinds of processes. So you mine the metals, you have factories that appropriately refine them, and then you have factories that build robots out of those resources, and then the robots are helping to dig up the resources. So I guess robotics is one of the key bottlenecks that lies between where we are now and most of the really transformative visions, right? Where if you just have a lot of resources and a lot of energy, the constraint is how much you can act in the physical world. I mean, that's, I guess, the labor part that Matt was referring to. And if that remains relatively constrained, and human population growth is fast but pretty slow relative to these changes, I would say.
Yeah, labor could remain constrained, and presumably there's there's some floor. It's discouragingly low, obviously, in some parts of the world, but there is a level below which labor can only get so cheap, right? Because people have to be able to survive, and so there's only so cheap that human labor can, at least in principle, actually get, unless you have unless you're intervening in the labor market with regulatory mechanisms, policies that are intervene to alter the pricing structures there. But yeah, there's only so even if you had an unlimited supply of human labor, there's still a sort of a minimum amount you can pay them. And with robots, I don't believe that that's true. If you close this loop, you sort of get labor approaching zero, a cost of machine labor approaching zero. If the robots are literally building more robots, and building more solar panels to capture the energy required to mine the materials to build more robots. I mean, if all of those loops are closed, then presumably you get something approaching zero cost of labor. But with human beings, I think that the limit at the floor is high. It's not is non-zero. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's just my thinking. Yeah.
I don't know if it's that simple. Go ahead, Dan. I think there's like multiple things going on there that, if you want to have this conversation in a more careful way, it's worth disentangling. And I'm not exactly sure how to disentangle them, but for example, labor and humans go together at the moment because that's how our civilization is kind of built. I don't know that that's like a fundamental concept. So you could imagine a society, and there are people talking about universal basic income and stuff. So this might be more relevant in the future. I don't know. Where you kind of start to disentangle those things. And then, for example, if you're talking about physical labor versus mental labor, there's a difference again in what the robots are doing. So you could consider the machinery that is currently doing a lot of the heavy lifting, literally speaking, in the mining industry, but that isn't doing the kind of cognitively heavy lifting. You could be that's the actual metal part, right? So you could be doing that in a closed loop with humans kind of controlling the machines, or you could be in a future where the machines are controlling themselves. Those are kind of two different futures, right? So I think it's worth clarifying what kind of robots are we talking about, and also what is the kind of, I don't know what to call it, but the word for what capitalism is, the way that we're arranging our society in relation to people and how much labor they need. or whether it's capitalism and people are working, or if something else. That's probably worth distinguishing to talk about, like, the cost of labor going to zero.
I think those are really good points. My team has a little bit of have some terms we use to describe the concepts you mentioned. So, and these are sort of pet definitions. They're not sort of widespread, but we at least internally, we distinguish work from labor. So work can be mechanized, and a lot of it has been. So big machines do huge amounts of work. Again, these are not formal terms in economics or anything. These are just internal to my team and the way we think about it. But we sort of distinguish work, which sort of brute force, and machines can do just so much more work than a human being can do, right? Bulldozer can move more earth in an hour than 100 human beings with shovels can move in a month. But still, just work. Labor has this dimension of intelligence to it, and it seems inseparable. And so the bulldozer, although it can do a great deal of work, it still needs a pilot, an operator, or whatever, and that is labor, because it involves cognitive effort, cognitive capacity. So you need some intelligence there, and so there's that intelligence is some extremely fundamental piece of what humans do when they labor. That is in addition to just simple mechanistic work. That's one thing. The other concept
that makes sense.
That my boss is very Jamie is very, very keen on is he borrows the term from elsewhere in the social sciences and doesn't quite hold. But anyway, again, this is internal to my team. He uses this idea of a social contract. And there's a large social science literature around social contracts, but what he takes that to mean, and I don't have a better term for it, but anyway, this is the one we use internally, is this idea of a sort of general social agreement that we have until now, or certainly have now. I think we've had it in most instances in some ways in societies in the past. But anyway, this idea that you earn your purchasing power, earn your access to claim on resources across society with work. At least that's one way to do it. That's one chief mechanism for doing it. The other way, your labor is something that you exchange for, and we have currency. So the currency is the medium, the mechanism that gives you purchasing power. And of course, the other way to earn that is with economic rents. So if you own capital and you generate rents, then you generate this currency from that money, and then you have purchasing power with that. And then of course that could change completely if purchasing power becomes a right of citizenship, and then you have some mechanism like universal basic income, perhaps, which still gives people money, but what it's really doing is giving them a claim on some fraction, some share of resources across society. And so we could certainly envision a situation where we really have a major change in what my boss calls this general social contract, right? Where we shift from thinking that you have to earn your crust to some situation where it's just a right of citizenship that everybody has some baseline claim, and maybe that's via money, maybe it's via something else like vouchers or coupons or something like certain things are just free, like maybe food is just free, certain types of food are just free, you can just however much you want, you can just go get them. I don't know, there different things have been proposed, but we can certainly imagine a quite a big shift from our current arrangement, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. I like those terms, except for labor, because it really evokes for me manual labor when you say labor. But maybe you could qualify it or something. I know you're saying these words are just relative to your team, so that's all they're meant to do. But I think it would help to clarify, because at least I was misled by that particular term.
Yeah, well, that would be helpful to me to come up with a better term for that, because internally we tend to distinguish human labor and machine labor, but maybe what would be a better way to think about that thing that is productive action, intelligently directed, is different from work, or that what I was using, that term work, this sort of productive action that is not intelligently directed, or intelligence isn't necessarily embedded within that. Anyway, it'd be helpful to me to get better terms. Anyway, and you started to say something a couple times, and I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I'm not sure what I was going to say those times. I was just thinking through another disruption I think is quite important, and I don't know where it fits on that list, but pervasive high-speed internet access, even in regions that are currently underdeveloped, say like Starlink sort of promises, I think is as transformative as low-cost energy, I think. Because if you think about why do people congregate in cities? I mean, we have so much rent-seeking behavior in society that it's sometimes very hard to motivate oneself to do anything, and a lot of that comes down to scarce resources like land. But it's not like we have a shortage of land. I mean, there's really a lot of land out there in Australia that, I mean, it's quite cheap. You just don't want to go there because you couldn't do anything there. But that's pretty rapidly changing. I mean, you can get 4G in much of the country now. And if the cost of infrastructure, say from robotics, laying pipelines and desalination plants, making free water very cheap, and you can take it wherever you want, and your 3D printing robot can print you a house in a weekend, those kinds of things exist already. It's just, there are startups in the US that can 3D print you a house in a weekend. Right now you have to pay for the final product, but if someone could just lend you their 3D printing robot, I think a lot of this social change I'm expecting to see over the next decade actually comes from that more than cheap energy. I mean, cheap energy enables that, but I think we'll live in a much more innovative and equal society when a lot of the rent seeking that currently dominates the way we organize things is undermined by these transformations. So I guess when I think through scenarios, another thing I'm doing in practice is looking for rent-seeking behavior and the constraints it currently imposes on what we think is possible or desirable, and how these disruptions will dismantle that rent-seeking.
One second, I'm just typing to capture that. That's fantastic. 1 second.
I want to chime in because I think that sounds good, but I think so this is getting back to like ways to think about these kind of transformations. And I think I have something to add to that, which is that the people who are out there rent seeking are also thinking, presumably, about what is going to happen and finding ways to rent seek in the future world. So one thing you could do in thinking about how these transformations are going to happen is try and think about ways that this transformation might be captured by interests that will kind of take advantage of the transformation and prevent us from getting to the kind of ideal scenario that we might like to envisage. And then if you can think about these kind of vulnerabilities, then you might be able to take steps to patch them, to mitigate them, and then help get to the actual ideal rather than suboptimal outcome. So, for example, maybe you imagine that automation is going to replace a lot of human labor, and you could think that, that'll be great if everyone has access to labor. But what if the company that is out there that ends up developing the best smart robot ends up kind of creating a very solid monopoly over this, and then derives a lot of power from that and ends up taking advantage of their position and taking some of the value out of the future for themselves rather than sharing it around equally or something like that. I guess you could think about that kind of opportunity, and then you could try and think of ways whether or not that will happen, and if it could happen, how might you prevent it from happening? I don't know if that's
So this is very interesting. My other boss, Tony, this is a key focus of his, and he doesn't frame it in terms of like rent-seeking and capital owners. His
Oh, to be clear,
perspective.
I don't. The only rent. It's not like capitalists are the only rent seekers. I mean,
Yes,
the
you're right.
elites that sit
Of
in
course.
public institutions are very good at rent seeking.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is so. Then that fits even better with what Tony is perspective is on this, because he's very concerned about rent seeking within government institutions, about cronyism and so forth. So he has a two-pronged perspective on this. It's basically he agrees that this is a great deal of risk there, that a lot of these benefits could be captured in a small number of hands going forward, and this is a real concern. And his perspective on this is that, number one, decentralization is hugely important and will also be very valuable. And so by that, what that means is he's super focused on how regions, cities, individual communities, even individual households can become independent in terms of their energy, their food production, their transportation capacities, all of that sort of stuff. He's very focused on how these new technologies facilitate decentralization and localization of production. So that's the first thing. That's sort of the first prong of his two prong. The other thing is he's sort of hyper focused on he's not a libertarian or conservative really, but he's hyper focused on government. That's the right way to frame it. He wants government efficiency. So he is on the one hand wants government out of markets and out of sectors where government has a corrupting influence. So, for example, where governments prop up energy utilities, for example, or bail out the auto industry and that kind of thing. He's bail out the banking industry. He was just absolutely livid, furious about those sorts of arrangements. But at the same time, he wants very strong regulation to prevent monopolies and to ensure that markets are competitive, so that the markets maintain their efficiency. So he wants a heavy hand from government, but only in very specific ways. And he wants government to be completely hands off in areas where markets can do the work, and corruption is a real sort of hazard, moral hazard, and otherwise. So this is sort of right in my other boss's wheelhouse. This set of concerns, right? We don't have a good view, a good answer for how to put all that together.
It's funny that I can tell a little bit that you're trying to distance your boss and from like a libertarian perspective, but I'm familiar with that distinction, and it occurs to me that it's more perhaps more libertarian, or more like truly libertarian or something, to be pro-market in the way that you're talking about, as opposed to pro-business. I'm sure you're familiar with that distinction of pro-market versus pro-business.
That's the key. That's the key. Absolutely. Yeah. One way to perhaps I should mention this because it's relevant for context. Tony, my boss, he is Venezuelan by birth. He's a naturalized American citizen. He moved alone to the United States at 17 to go to MIT, and then is naturalized since then. He's the only. I think some of his family has joined him in the U.S. now, but he basically moved from Venezuela, and so he's sort of fervently anti corruption, anti-communist, socialist on the one hand. So in that respect, he does sort of has a libertarian bent to him, but at the same time, he despises corruption in companies and industries every bit as much as within governments. And so what he really is focused on is markets and that distinction between businesses and markets. Yes. So anyway.
Yeah. That's
interesting.
This is getting a little off track, but I wanted to say that it's growing kind of frustrating to me, the amount of times I see people kind of complaining about the excesses of governments, but then turning a blind eye to, I guess, the alternative being these businesses who are growing massive. So if people say, for example, you want small government, but then they're totally fine with Amazon and Google, and it just seems to me like, how if you could have big government or big business, surely you'd prefer big government because then at least it's democratic. But anyway, yeah, this is really becoming a bit of a tangent. I wanted to suggest that Boss, who's looking into this stuff about how to arrange society to be more kind of robust through decentralization, I hope he's reading people who are writing even sort of historically about different schemes of arranging societies. And I haven't read some of these resources myself, but
guys, I'm really sorry. I have to pause you for just a second. I have a baby monitor. Okay. My toddler just got out of bed and is now thumping around upstairs. 1 second. I will be back as soon as I can. All right. I'm really sorry to interrupt you. Just a second.
Yeah, I guess the point about people worried about governments and big companies to inconsistent degrees. Yeah, this is. I'm often struck in discussions how paranoid people are. Maybe paranoid is the wrong word. How cognizant people are of governments paying attention to their private communications.
Or interfering with their freedoms.
Yeah, while they're very content to let their information stream of everything that goes into their head be controlled by one company or maybe two. And I think the mental model sometimes is very tribal. So it's something like, I can't tolerate whichever side of politics dictating something in my life because they're the enemy tribe. But at least historically, maybe Facebook doesn't feel to you like it fits into either tribe. Maybe that will change as those companies become thoroughly dominated by politics to a degree that they aren't right now. But
that's so. Who kind of is a little bit more software engineering and like that. Like self imagine the ways technological could be so impactful users. It makes me some kind of radical aimed at companies and government. Please come and say this bullshit. I get mad at Amazon and I get mad at Facebook when they make decisions and they're like, why won't you even let me do it this way? All you would have to do is implement this feature and give me some choice. You're really harming my freedom. And that's the kind of argument that people make against governments when they want to protect their freedoms. And yeah, our society, I guess, is kind of giving a bit of a license to these companies to do whatever they want. I mean, I'm not saying that Facebook should just bend itself to my whims, but I guess it's the same kind of frustrations. I don't want to yield power over my life to them any more than I want to yield it to anyone else. And I think, that's kind of inconsistent.
I think it's interesting in this context of this discussion, because I think what has to happen is a kind of more first principles analysis of what makes up society. I mean, we have these kind of stable equilibria where we solve certain coordination problems among people, and we allocate certain, we sort of agree to stick certain parts of that solution to the coordination problem in various institutions. Some of it's in government, some of it's in companies. And then we kind of get over-attached to those labels and those boundaries. And then there's nothing really fundamental about them, right? It's like, at this point in time, with this technology, we solve these coordination problems with these institutions. But we get very used to them. And then, a lot of these discussions around Facebook and these big tech companies now, they're kind of clearly actually the vocabulary is wrong. Right? There's a 20th century way of thinking about these things, but in the 21st century, you really shouldn't make an overly strong distinction between a nation state and something like Google, Apple, or Amazon, right? I mean, in many respects,
Yeah.
so there's this funny tinge to discussions where you like the categories they're sort of antiquated in a way, and we don't have the new vocabulary or something, right? Like there's like we're in a transitional period somehow.
I think people. I know there's a book that kind of connection between corporate and like mostly for the workers in the rather than the impact of people. But anyway, what was I going to say?
Hey guys, I'm back. Thanks for being patient.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah, I was going to say so, but actually, I head out soon this week. This is a little bit compared to what was.
Oh, this has been very interesting, giving me lots of great things to think about as you always do. So I really do appreciate it. I wish we could do it in person over beers for more than just an hour at a time. But it's really interesting, and I've got a big set of notes here. Fun to go back and think through them. I'm now really going to spend some time, Dan, looking for this rent-seeking behavior that we simply presume is a fixture, because it's a feature of the institutions that we've got, and how might things look different or change if some of those fundamental elements of the economy really start and society start shifting, or if the ground shifts underneath those things. I suppose is maybe a better way to think about it.
Could I also
very cool.
You guys should hire some brilliant young Chinese intellectual or something. Like it seems to me, actually, a lot of these discussions are happening at a very high level by very smart people in China in a way that's probably inaccessible to you unless there's Chinese people on your team that I'm not aware of. But and the style of thinking about these problems is very different there. So I think there's a lot to be gained from comparing notes on the different perspectives on the same sort of set of transformations, but coming from a very different civilizational, legal, the way Chinese people solve coordination problems and imagine solving them in the face of these disruptions will be very different, and that's probably very useful.
Absolutely.
I don't know anybody off the top of my head because that's not the circle of people that Lavender's usually plugged into in China, but it must be a way of finding.
I would hear. Thanks all. Thanks, especially Adam. See ya.
Yeah, it's something that my team is definitely looking at is diversifying the folks that are both on our team and that are in our sort of first concentric ring around us in a network of people that we coordinate and partner with in various capacities. And very high on the list are bringing people in from both China and India, because those societies, anything that shifts in those societies shifts the planet. So point very well taken, Dan. I could not agree more. And exciting things are happening in China already. We had we like to flatter ourselves, I suppose, and think that maybe we tipped the needle a little bit in China's transportation policy back in 2017 with the first transportation report we wrote. It got a lot of interest then, and very recently, China has announced more detailed plans. I don't know if it's officially part of any 5-year plan yet, but at any rate, there's now quite a bit of attention and a big spotlight on precision fermentation and cellular agriculture, both of those technologies together, for food production, food independence, and so on, because of course China has a lot of food imports. So major implications there, strategic and geopolitical implications, not just economic and so forth. So fascinating developments. And you're right, the perspective the Chinese perspective on all of this is something that we absolutely must be benefiting from and be tapping into. So yeah, for sure. Yeah, we're going to be doing hiring this year, and that's definitely something that we're considering. Is how do we get super smart people from these other cultures to join us?
Yeah. I'll recommend a Twitter account. Do you know who Balaji Srinivasan is?
Oh,
Oh, okay. I'll forward you a Twitter link. He's like
definitely.
one of the sages of remote work and cryptocurrency related predictions about how the future will be different. That's a very interesting Twitter account to follow. Okay, on that note, maybe we should wrap it up.
Great. Well, thanks as always, and
Thank you.
I look forward to the next one. Thanks,
Yep.
guys.
See ya.
Here.